συνδυασμένα παρέχουν ουσιαστικά την πιο πλήρη και προσβάσιμη αφήγηση που υπάρχει πάνω στο ζήτημα των άτια. Το τελευταίο του έργο, του Richard, το οποίο υπάρχουν δύο αντίτυπα έξω, αν ενδιαφέρεται κανείς, είναι το UFOs for the 21st Century Mind και είναι μια νέα προσέγγιση του όλου ζητήματος. Συζητάει εκεί τις θεάσεις, τις συναντήσεις, την πολιτική, τη συγκάλυψη, τους αρχαίους εξωγήινους, την επιστήμη, την αποκάλυψη και μας παρακινεί να σκεφτόμαστε κριτικά, όπως και να είμαστε ανοιχτόμυαλοι στο σημερινό κόσμο. Δεν υπάρχει πλευρά του φαινομένου που να μην έχει μελετήσει ο Ρίτσαρτ σήμερα. Έχει μια εβδομαδιαία ραδιοφωνική εκπομπή στο σταθμό KGRA, που ονομάζεται The Richard Dolan Show. Είναι συχνά φιλοξενούμενος σε πολλές εκπομπές, Coast to Coast. Έχει εμφανιστεί σε πολλές τηλεοπτικές σειρές και ντοκιμαντέρ, ένα από τα οποία θα δούμε αύριο. Και είμαστε πάρα πολύ τυχεροί και ευτυχείς που τον έχουμε μαζί μας. Να τον καλωσορίσουμε.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to be here. I thought it would be a good idea to give Jenny Sari as much stress as possible before I arrived, and for that reason had a very serious passport issue that almost prevented me from being here. I did my best to give you a stroke. I didn't quite, but on top of that, I was actually the most impossible person for her to deal with, just in trying to communicate with me. Part of my charm, I guess. Anyway, I'm very grateful to Jenny for organizing this for me and for all of you who've been involved in bringing me here. This is my first time to Greece, and I absolutely love it. Yesterday was my 54th birthday, and it was the best birthday I ever had. I spent it on the Acropolis. How can that be the best? I'm going to give what I think is a helpful overview, a good introductory lecture to the UFO topic. For those of you who may not be particularly familiar with it, this might be helpful. And even for those of you who are, I think there may be new information here for you. A very quick background, because I want to get right into my subject matter. I've been studying this subject for, I think, 22 years. Back in the early 1990s, I still had an idea that I would finish my PhD in history. I was studying Cold War history, so United States and Soviet relations was my specialty. Back at that time, I was focusing on the year 1950 and studying United States national security policy, also things like the birth of the CIA, relations, early American imperialism, globalism, all of those matters, nothing to do with flying saucers at all. And in 1994, I was in a bookstore and saw a UFO book with the subtitle, The Worldwide UFO Cover-Up. And at that moment I thought, well, that's interesting. I'll never forget flipping through the pages and seeing many names that I had been studying in my own academic work, but in a completely different context. And I thought, well, this is very interesting. I didn't know if I believed that UFOs were real or not at that time, but I had one question that I wanted to answer, and that was this a matter of our history? Is it true, as many people have argued, that the UFO subject was considered important to people, particularly in the American national security establishment? That's something that I was really studying a lot. In our normal culture, we of course get very little of that, but we hear claims, and I thought I'd like to know. I don't want this big question hovering over me for the rest of my life while I study American diplomacy. I wanted to know if this UFO subject was anything whatsoever. By the way, thank you, Leonidas, for the coffee. Very nice. So I decided that I would spend 2 or 3 months to throw myself into this subject simply to answer the question, was this something that was important? And if it was ever considered important, did the military and intelligence community ever stop considering it important? And if they considered it important, why did they consider it important? All of the logical questions, and I thought I would simply do this as a personal research project. I did not expect that it would take up literally the rest of my life, which it has done. It has been the most fascinating journey I can imagine, and I want to share some of that with you. So I consider this subject something of a great discrepancy. That is, on the one hand, this phenomenon, that is of UFOs, is everywhere in this world. It is in every continent. It has been going, as far as we can tell, throughout human history. There are thousands of sightings every year, everywhere. And at the same time, it gets no attention, no serious attention, from the establishment power structure. Not officially. It's sometimes a subject to ridicule, and you have to wonder why. And then, as I discovered at the same time, as I went through a mountain of declassified military documents and intelligence community documents, it was obvious to me that this was getting very serious interest from the classified world. So that is a discrepancy, and I wanted to know why. Why is it ridiculed on the one hand and taken very seriously in secret? I won't read all of this to you. These are two different U.S. government statements over a period of many different years on UFOs. One is from 1949 and one is from 2011. They both say basically the same thing. And they both use really bureaucratic language to do it. I find that when governments use such stuffy language, they're always trying to hide something and always trying to make themselves sound more intelligent than they really are, because they don't want you to argue with them. But it has been consistent over the decades that the United States government, they've said the same thing over and over about UFOs. In 1949, this one statement was, all evidence and analysis indicate that reports of unidentified flying objects are, and then they give all of these reasons why it's not a real phenomenon. People misinterpret conventional objects, or a mild form of mass hysteria, or people who just make things up and create a hoax, or people who have psychopathological problems. That was 1949. That was their official explanation then. More recently, now that everyone is much more politically correct, governments don't say quite the same thing, but they still say basically the same thing when it comes to UFOs. There was a petition to get the Obama White House to acknowledge UFOs, and the response, we actually got a response, and it was this one. The U.S. government has no evidence that any life exists outside our planet, or that an extraterrestrial presence has contacted or engaged any member of the human race. And this is my favorite part. In addition, they say, there is no credible information to suggest that any evidence is being hidden from the public's eye. In other words, my government is saying, there's really nothing to UFOs, and no, we're not hiding anything from you at all. That takes a lot of guts. A lot of guts to make such a statement, as I will show you why. How many sightings every year? It's actually impossible to know how many UFO sightings every year there are. Back in the days of the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book, that was their official office to collect UFO reports. Over a 20-year period, they collected about 12,000 UFO reports. Today, we get about 12,000 a year from two websites alone in North America. One is called the National UFO Reporting Center, and another one is called the MUFON, or Mutual UFO Network website. And they each come in with about 6,000 or more individual sightings every single year. Every year. And that's only US and Canada, basically. How many sightings go every year in Europe? Nobody knows. And the reason is because there are really no websites, there are no major organizations that are collecting or that try to collect all of the sightings. There are no such websites or organizations in South America. There are very good research groups in all these places, but there's no source where you can just say, how many sightings are there? They don't exist. We don't really know. Asia, we have no idea how many sightings every year occur in China. We have no idea how many sightings occur in Australia. We have no idea how many sightings occur in the immense continent of Africa. We just don't know. But they happen. We know that they happen because there are reports. But we just don't have numbers, which I think is a shame. I think we should have numbers. This is a very important subject, and at the very least, we should know what we are dealing with. We also know that this phenomenon goes way back in human history. I'm not going to go over most of these stories with you. They are fascinating. There's a story from ancient Egypt, from the reign of Thutmose III, about 3,500 years ago. This is the dynasty of Akhenaten and King Tut and Nefertiti, the same dynasty. They had a story of, it was written down, of this fiery object that appeared in the sky for days, frightened all of the Egyptians. They went to the pharaoh for guidance. Where else would you go? I don't think the pharaoh knew what to do. It lasted for 3 days, and then it moved away. I don't know what that was. We have stories from the ancient Vedic tales in India of the Vimanas, the flying chariots of the gods. There's a lot of debate over what those Vimanas or what those chariots really were. But I will say, some of the stories are very interesting, and they are suggestive, let us say, that there may have been something very unusual in our ancient past. In the Bible, we have the famous story of Ezekiel and the wheel of Ezekiel that he saw in his prophecy. That is an artist's rendition of Ezekiel's wheel. It's quite interesting. If you're not familiar with it, you may want to read it. He describes a very complex piece of machinery, it seems to me. And I think until the 20th century, until we were familiar with UFOs, historians and scholars would interpret it a certain way, but I think when you read some of these stories with a modern sensibility, we might look at them in a different way. There's a story, maybe one of the earliest excellent stories of somewhat of the modern era, took place in Russia, not that far from present-day Moscow, a town that doesn't exist anymore called Robo-Zero. We know about this because it was written about by a priest, and he was writing to his bishop about a sighting that took place in this village where all of the townspeople were in church. And they saw, very much like the Egyptian account I told you, of this fiery object that came over the town, stayed there for 30 minutes, then went away, then came back, then went away, and then came back again. They described how the waters got hot and how the fish and creatures left the water, and much more. How it shone a bright ray down to the ground. That was part of the story. And the priest was simply writing to his bishop asking for spiritual guidance. He just didn't know what to do. It's a very interesting story. Again, the problem with these ancient stories that we have is simply that they weren't really investigated the way we would investigate a UFO report today. But there are quite a few of these. And my feeling is that they are suggestive that we have not been alone for a very long time. That's my feeling. It's a very interesting story from the year 1845 near Sicily and Malta in the Mediterranean Sea. This was recorded by the American scholar Charles Fort. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with him. Charles Fort, about 100 years ago, spent all of his time in the New York Public Library. going through old newspaper accounts of strange things, including now what we would call UFO reports. And this is one that he found. It was a very precisely written account by a ship's captain who stated simply that he was out with some of his crew in the water, and they saw 3 lit bodies, luminous bodies, rise out of the sea, less than a kilometer from the ship's location. So quite close. They saw the objects for 10 minutes, and the lights moved off. That's that. What is that in 1845? In the United States, as we approached the 20th century, we encountered something known as the airship mystery. This is quite interesting as well. Starting in the city of Sacramento, California, and spreading throughout the western United States, coming east, culminating in a sighting over the city of Chicago a few months later. There were a lot of fake sightings, I think, that were recorded here, but there were quite a few that looked legitimate to many of us. Large objects, like blimps, except that we didn't have blimps flying in the United States at this time. They were not there. Airship technology was still at least a decade away from the real Zeppelins that were able actually to have some range and to fly around. What these things were is anybody's guess. Some of them had powerful headlights and searchlights coming down from them, at least as described by witnesses. Strange. As we get into the 20th century, what we notice is a very great upsurge in sightings, even before 1947. And I wondered about this, and I think that at least some of the reasons is because we humans just have much greater ability to detect strange things. If you were a member of an ancient tribe that had no literacy 1,000 years ago and you saw an object, what could you really do about it? You might talk about it, it might become part of the oral history tradition of your culture, but that would be about it. But by the 20th century, we had a very large global civilization, and we were in the air ourselves. And we also, by the Second World War, had developed very sophisticated methods of detecting objects electronically, like radar, and much more. And so it was as if our sensors were out detecting these things. And indeed, that's what we started to do. I also suspect that we became of much greater interest to them with our technology. I do believe that there's a connection with our development of nuclear technology. As I'll mention in just a moment, there were many inexplicable, dramatic sightings of unknown objects over American nuclear facilities. And also, as we later learned, over many Russian, Soviet nuclear facilities. So I suspect that we became of much greater interest to them as well. This is a story, a sighting, that very few people know about. I wrote about it in my last book. I found this case myself. I was in the Canadian National Archives a few years ago. And this is a place called Aylmer Lake. And you can see it on the map there. This is in northern Canada. It's very remote. To this day, nobody can live there. Trees don't grow there. It's fantastic fishing, and that's about it. I came across an account written by an elderly Canadian gentleman who, at that time, Canadians could report their UFOs to the police, and it would go to the National Council. And all that they did is they collected the reports. They didn't study them, and they just put them in the National Archives where you could read them. So this elderly gentleman was talking about a job in 1936 when he was 25 years old. His job, this is a cool job, was to fly around northern Canada doing aerial mapping. So taking photographic aerial shots of this remote Canadian region. When you're 25 years old, that's a great job. He had an aircraft that could land on the water. And so he said, I was doing a pre-flight check at that location. That's what it looks like. There's nothing there for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And he said, for whatever reason, I just decided to look straight up above me. And directly above me, he said, was the most magnificent configuration of an airship one could imagine. It was gray. It did not have any reflection. He couldn't tell how large it was because there were no clouds in the sky. But he thought it was pretty large. And he said it was slightly elongated, and it was in a north-south configuration. And he said instantly it turned east-west, and then instantly took off without making a sound. Within a moment, it was in the horizon. It was gone. That was his sighting. He submitted his military records for the government just so they could determine, they could prove who he was. I wasn't there in 1936. You were not there in 1936, but I will say that I read his account very carefully and I believed it. I think he was telling the truth. Now, I don't know what that could be in 1936 in the middle of nowhere. As we come into the Second World War, of course, we get what is known as the Foo Fighter phenomenon. This was in both theaters of the war, the European and the Pacific War, had many reports of objects that were in the air that were not explainable. Pilots would be flying along and they would say a lighted object would fly alongside my airplane, fly along for a while. Sometimes those objects caused mechanical disturbances in the aircraft, and then eventually they would shoot straight up. There was a speculation among the Americans and British intelligence that these might be some kind of German war weapons. There is no evidence that this is the case. My friend and colleague Joseph Farrell has speculated that this is so, and there are a couple of hints along the way that possibly the Germans were working on something like this, but I don't think he thinks that that explains all of it. I don't believe that it explains all of it. These were also seen in the Pacific theater as well. Here's the important thing about the Foo Fighters, as far as I can say. They were investigated in great detail by several intelligence organizations, including the U.S. 8th Air Force, the OSS, which was the predecessor of the CIA, and also by British intelligence. And what we do not have is their conclusions of what they were investigating. We don't have them. I'd like to know. This is something that affects the nation of Greece, the ghost rocket phenomenon. This actually started over Scandinavia, right after the war ended. In 1946, over Sweden primarily, something unusual was going on. People were seeing these objects that were flying around Sweden, sometimes landing, sometimes crashing. It got a lot of attention, and several top-level American generals went to Sweden to confer with the Swedish government. No one knew what to call them. They called them ghost rockets. The ghost rocket phenomenon spread through France, into central part of Europe, and over Greece in 1946. The very famous physicist Paul Santorini, Greek, he was very much involved in the Manhattan Project, was in Greece at this time and spoke about this during the 1960s. He said this phenomenon alarmed the Greek government and that he was personally supplied with a team of engineers to research this. Question number one was to decide whether these were Russian missiles or Russian technology of some sort. They concluded this was not Russian and these were not missiles. And then he said at that point that they reached that conclusion, and this is his statement, before we could do any more, the Army, after conferring with foreign officials, ordered the investigation stopped. So I think we can assume those foreign officials were American. Something happened to stop that investigation. Did they already know what they were dealing with and they didn't want the wrong people to investigate any further? That's what I think. Then we come to Roswell, 1947. I think most of you have heard of Roswell. Something went down there. To this day, it's a big argument over what it was. I think there's a very, very strong case, that what went down at Roswell was not something that we humans made. That's my opinion. There's a great deal of witness testimony to that effect that indicate that the materials that were recovered were extraordinary. There's a great deal of witness testimony as well to the existence of non-human bodies that were recovered there. We know that the object that was recovered there was publicized briefly. That's the headline on the top left there. Roswell Army Airfield, RAAF, captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. And then the following day came the next headline saying, no, it was not anything like a flying saucer. It was just a weather balloon. And that story held for many years. Meanwhile, however, while the public was being told that there was nothing to these flying saucers, while the public was being told that this was simply misidentification and imaginary things, within the classified world, things were very serious. That's a picture of American Air Force General Nathan Twining. In 1947, he was a 3-star general. He later earned 4 stars and became Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. Nathan Twining was a very powerful man. So in September of 1947, Twining received a request from another general who simply wanted to know about these flying saucers. Is this anything we have to deal with? What's going on with flying saucers was basically the question. And Twining wrote this 3-page letter back to him. It was classified for many years. This is what he said. The phenomenon, he said, was real. It was not visionary. It was not fictitious. Right there, that statement alone is important. And had that statement been officially let out in 1947, I think we would have a very different world. But it was classified. And then he went on in this letter to describe the specific attributes of these objects as reported by military personnel. He said they showed extreme rates of climb and maneuverability, and action which must be considered evasive when sighted. That's interesting. Several other qualities here. My favorite, circular or elliptical in shape, flat on bottom, and domed on top. And I would like us to ask, what in 1947 would be flat on the bottom and domed on the top? That would show incredible maneuverability and all of these other things. No sound as well. These were silent. So in 1947, this here is proof. It's not a hint, it's not a suggestion. It is proof that the United States military was dealing with a phenomenon that they knew was real and they knew was extraordinary. And they also didn't know where it was coming from. By the end of 1947, by the early part of 1948, within the American classified community, among analysts who were studying this, they had some consensus and they had some argument. The consensus was that UFOs were someone's technology. There was no debate about this. They were not saying, oh, maybe it's some unusual weather phenomenon or meteorological phenomenon. There may have been a couple of outsiders who wondered about this, but people within the classified world were quite convinced that UFOs were technology. They also agreed that it was serious, that whatever this was very important. And they also agreed that they had to continue studying this secretly. They were not willing to share this information with the public just yet. Now, there was debate within that community as well. There were a number of analysts who did believe that this was a Soviet or Russian technology. It was, after all, right after the Second World War. There was a lot of tension going on with the Americans and the Soviets, and this was a serious concern. There was also speculation that these were secret American technology. Again, that's a logical thing to wonder about. And there was also right from the beginning, a serious faction that believed that it was not Soviet and that it was not American, but that it was interplanetary. That was the word they liked to use back then. I learned something else during the research of my very first book that I think is quite significant, and this is that the US president at the time, Harry Truman, was receiving quarterly briefings on UFOs. Every 3 months, he received a secret briefing on UFOs from the summer of 1948 until the end of his presidency by that man there, Colonel Robert Landry, who later became a major general. Landry gave a very long interview about this before he died in the 1970s. Most of the interview was just about his career, and he had an interesting career. And an interesting thing at the end of this interview was that the interviewer said, "What about UFOs?" And you can read the transcript, it's very interesting. Landry, I think, was not expecting the question, and he said, "Oh, well, UFOs, yes, we actually were interested in that as well." Really? He said, the president, just like any other citizen, was curious about what these things were. I'm thinking, the president is not just like any other citizen. And then stated that Truman called him into his office in the summer of 1948 and said, "You are going to be my liaison with the US Air Force, and in conjunction with the CIA, you will brief me every 3 months on this subject." And then what Landry said was, "Well, we didn't really have anything important that we discovered, so we didn't keep any records." And I don't say, "What? You didn't keep any records?" Harry Truman was a busy man. There was a lot of important things going on at that time in history. The fact that he took every 3 months took time out of his schedule to get briefings on this, I think that they were probably records. But there's an old saying, the first rule in keeping secrets is nothing on paper. And I think something important was going on during those meetings. Despite the fact that there are no records of the Truman briefings, we have a lot of other interesting memos or documents that were released through the Freedom of Information Act in the 1970s. It's an interesting thing to remember. When most of these documents were being created in the 1940s and 1950s, there was no Freedom of Information Act. This really came into being as something significant by the late 1970s, after America had gone through Vietnam and after we had our own scandal of Watergate. There was a major movement to strengthen freedom of information for citizens. As a result of that, that's why we have the thousands of pages of UFO documents that are available. And by the way, that act was really, in my opinion, useful primarily during the 1970s. It became very unfriendly during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. But be that as it may, we received a lot of documents in the 1970s, and what I'm about to show you are some of them. This is a memo from the FBI, early 1949. And it came out after an enormous number of sightings over Los Alamos National Laboratories, another nuclear site. Significant. And this memo here says that the matter of flying saucers is considered top secret by intelligence officers of the Army and Air Force. And then went on. Actually, this is a very long memo. It's many pages, describing some unbelievably detailed sightings of extraordinary craft. And just stating, during the past 2 months, various sightings of unexplained phenomena have been reported near the Atomic Energy Commission installation at Los Alamos. It got a lot of important attention. This is some of the early, one of the early good photographs, interesting photographs of a UFO. It was famous at the time. Out in the American West, in the state of Oregon, 2 photographs were taken by a farming couple over their property. That's photograph number 1, and this is photograph number 2. That's a close-up of it. It made the cover of Life magazine at the time, a very big magazine. It's been analyzed many, many times. There have always been attempts to debunk these photographs. I think they have held up very well over the years. In the United States, there's a very well-known optical physicist named Dr. Bruce Maccabee, who I think has subjected these photographs to more analysis than anyone in the world, and has concluded that they are legitimate, they are not hoaxes. 1950 was a big year, as it turns out, for UFOs. There was, this is a memo relating to the Hanford Atomic Energy Commission. Hanford is in the state of Washington, not Washington, D.C., but on the West Coast, in the Northwest, not far from Canada. I'll just read this to you. It's really fascinating. Since July 30, 1950, objects round in form have been sighted over the Hanford plant. Air Force jets attempted interception with negative results. All units, including the anti-aircraft battalion, radar units, Air Force fighter squadrons, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, that is the FBI, have been alerted for further observation. Wow. Again, this was a classified memo at the time. No one knew about it. By the time these all came out years later, my country had already turned into a bunch of zombies on toxic food, and I don't think anyone really paid attention. I think if people had known in 1950, it might have been a different story. In 1952, there was this very large number of UFO sightings in the United States, very well recorded, including, a lot of them were military, but this one took place over the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. This photograph, by the way, it's a legitimate photograph. The real question is, what are those objects, and are they legitimate UFOs, or are they reflections of lights? It could be that they are reflections of lights. But the fact is that according to air traffic controllers, one of whom I spoke to shortly before he died, and many witnesses on the ground, and many radar operators, that for several weekends in a row over Washington, D.C., there were serious incursions by unknown objects with great maneuverability. The Air Force scrambled jets repeatedly to get these things, and they had no luck. One statement from the senior air traffic controller said, "Their movements were completely radical compared to those of ordinary aircraft. For 6 hours, there were at least 10 unidentifiable objects moving above Washington. They were not ordinary aircraft." This made headlines. And this story threatened to spiral out of control. So what the United States Air Force did immediately after this was to hold a press conference, a large press conference, in which they said, well, we don't know what some of these UFOs are, but I can tell you most of them, we have no evidence that any of them are hostile or anything truly extraordinary. And these particular sightings, the Air Force said, were the result of a strange weather phenomenon. And they got away with it. The air traffic controllers were not allowed to speak at that press conference. They were all very unhappy about it. But this is how it works. We now know this. This is probably would get my vote, this memo, as maybe the most important of them all. I believe that this memo should be taught in schools around the world. At the end of 1952, the CIA was thinking long and hard about UFOs. And it had been a year of incredible sightings. And the director of scientific intelligence for the CIA, his name was H. Marshall Chadwell, wrote a note to his boss, the director of the CIA. And one paragraph, he said this: "At this time, the reports of incidents convince us that there is something going on which must have immediate attention. Sightings of unexplained objects at great altitudes and traveling at high speeds in the vicinity of major U.S. defense installations are of such nature that they are not attributable to natural phenomena or known types of aerial vehicles." I would just ask you to think about that. What is he saying here? Not natural phenomena, and nothing that we know, and these objects are traveling at incredible speeds, around sensitive military installations. What could they be? It doesn't leave too many options available, except the certainty that this was a very serious matter. And yet at the same time, through the 1950s, during the period that the United States government persecuted Wilhelm Reich and destroyed him and left him to die in prison, they're telling the public the same thing, that there are no real UFOs, that they're not a national security threat, and that they exist solely in the imagination. This, by the way, is the Project Blue Book investigative team. You can see how helpful it is that they have a big map of the solar system behind them. I'm sure that was very useful. I had that when I was a kid growing up. It was a cool poster. When you're 7 years old, it's one thing. When you're an Air Force officer investigating UFOs, you really have to wonder, was this helpful for them? But this discrepancy between the reality and the fantasy that they're peddling to the world is very pronounced. And it just went on for years and years. I don't want to run out of time, so some of these documents are probably not that necessary for me to go over, but I'll read this one. This one's from 1953. Again, another nuclear connection here. The Oak Ridge Nuclear Facility in the state of Tennessee. A very important facility in the development of nuclear technology, and in the 1950s, really important. One of the Oak Ridge engineers reported this. There was a black object that zoomed across the sky. Well, I'll just read a little bit of it here. He says, object was extremely black in color. It did not leave a vapor trail. No sound was heard. And then he says this, the object flew east at a tremendous speed for about 3 miles where it stopped. The object was then joined by 2 more of these same objects. They created a V formation, and then at tremendous speed flew east and were gone. 1953. Within the U.S., there was, we could say, a crescendo of sightings by the mid-1960s. Quite a bit. And this, despite the fact that the U.S. Air Force and the government continually tried to tell the public, this is all fictional, there's nothing to this. Well, whoever was operating these things apparently didn't get the memo that they weren't supposed to exist, because they continued to fly all over the place. And it got to be such a problem that the United States Congress started to talk about it. A future president, Gerald Ford, who was a congressman at the time, actually spoke in Congress on behalf of his constituents and said, I'm not really satisfied with the answers I'm getting from the Air Force. So what the U.S. Air Force then did was to, they had to do something. And so they ended up paying money to the University of Colorado in something that became known as the Condon Committee. And that's Edward Condon right there, who led the committee, and you can see how seriously he takes the subject of UFOs with his toy flying saucer on top of the report. Isn't that funny, he's thinking. The Condon Committee investigation was honestly a true joke of an investigation. We know, looking at it through history, that it was always going to have a negative conclusion about UFOs. It was absolutely predetermined. Privately, Condon said to one of his scientists that if they were to have an actual affirmative conclusion that UFOs existed, he said, I would never tell the public. I would take it in a locked briefcase to the president and let the president decide. So in other words, their goal always was publicly just to state that there's nothing to this. There was a lot of unhappy scientists in this study who knew that it was a rigged investigation. What was interesting is that the Condon report, if you ever read this big, fat, massive book, 30% of the cases in it are unexplained. I don't think Condon, I really literally think Condon never read the report. He just wrote the conclusion, which was then all that the press ever read, in which he said, there's really no reason for the Air Force to study UFOs. They offer no scientific value of anything. We don't really have any chance to gain any scientific knowledge out of it, so the Air Force should simply drop the project. And the Air Force said, thank you so very much, we're out of it. We're not going to study UFOs anymore publicly. Of course, the Air Force and other military groups in the US continue to study UFOs. They just do it secretly. In my view, this is an undermining of democratic rule. After all, Project Blue Book, which was what the Air Force was running to study UFOs, may have been incompetent, they may have been dishonest, which they were, but they were, in theory, responsible to taxpayers. They were responsible to the public. And once that went away, the government could simply say, well, if you see a UFO, too bad, we're not really investigating, we have nothing to do with it, which was a lie. There's a memo that we have from 1969 from a senior general who stated that reports of UFOs which could affect national security are not part of the Blue Book system. They are filed in accordance with other classified protocols. In other words, what he's saying is that the important UFO sightings were always going through different channels anyway in the classified world, and that remains true to this day. In other words, after 1969, the American public was locked out, in a sense, of the UFO problem, at least as far as the government went. And as I was mentioning earlier, the development of the Freedom of Information Act, this was very important, and it remains important. So after Blue Book closed in 1969, what were researchers going to do? We can't go to the government for help, can we? Well, what we discovered is that we could petition the government for documents about this subject, and to the great shock of many people, by the late 1970s, thousands of pages of UFO documents were being released. Now, these were not the Holy Grail, many of them. They were not the highest classification documents, but some of them were very, very interesting, and some of them I just showed you a little while ago, and there are quite a few more. So they show that something important was going on, and they proved that the government was lying about it. So this was a significant development. Meanwhile, these sightings have continued and continued. At the end of 1975, along the American-Canadian border, across the entire border, from the East Coast, the state of Maine, going all the way out to the Rocky Mountains, in September, October, November, going into December, a series of absolutely awe-inspiring UFO sightings took place over sensitive military bases. I can't go over all of them, but I have some quotes that I pulled out from some of these documents. One of them, this is over Lake Michigan. The pilot said, I know this might sound crazy, but I would estimate that the UFO sped away from us doing approximately 1,000 knots. That's over 1,000 miles per hour, very fast. Particularly, that object had been hovering at one point, and then it just sped away at an unbelievable speed. Some of these sightings were very explicit. And the other one that I want to read this quote here, this is over in the state of Montana. Objects could not be intercepted. Personnel at 4 Strategic Air Command sites reported observing intercepting F-106s arrive in the area. Sighted objects turned off their lights upon arrival of interceptors and back on again upon their departure. So in other words, there were these objects that were up there. They sent jets to go intercept and investigate, and when the jets arrived, the objects disappeared. And when the jets left, the objects reappeared. This happened a number of times. On one occasion, I was on Coast to Coast AM radio with George Norrie. Anyone know Coast to Coast? Yeah. A few. In the United States and North America, it's major late-night radio. And the host asked me, he said, "Richard, what do you believe is the best UFO case?" That's just how he talks. And I said, probably this one. This case from Tehran in Iran in 1976, September 1976. It might be. It might be the best because it's got extensively excellent documentation. It's a document that went to the President of the United States, who was Gerald Ford. It also went to the Director of the CIA, who was George Bush Sr. And it also went to the National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger. They all received that report. And it describes an encounter over the city of Tehran. This is back in the days of the Shah, before the Islamic Revolution. So Iran was a very close U.S. ally. And an object that was there, seen by many citizens of Tehran. They called the local airport, who saw the same thing. He called the Air Force. They scrambled and sent 2 jets, one after the other, to investigate this. Both of them, at a range of about 25 miles, so about 40 kilometers, had a perfect visual of the object. It was intensely bright, very large. They had it on their radar at the same time. It had a large radar return. And both of them, at a range of 25 miles, lost control over certain of their instrumentation on their plane. One of them was about to fire a missile at it when his missile went offline. At one point, the object dropped another smaller object out of it, which then went to pursue the jet. Imagine being that pilot. He sees this object coming at him, and all he could do was turn as tightly as possible to get away from the object, which then turned inside his own arc, he said, before it rejoined the original craft. Pretty impressive, I would say. It would be impressive today, let alone in 1976. There's much more to this case, but I'll leave you with that for now. 2 years later in Iran, there are these 2 separate photographs that were taken, June and in October of 1978. You can see it's almost an identical object. These were found in American military records. They were collecting UFO data from Iran. In the nation of Bolivia in 1978, which, by the way, was a very big year of sightings worldwide, a very significant year, 1978, something went down in the mountains of Bolivia. I don't know what it was. I think there's evidence to show that it was not an ordinary satellite, and it was in the U.S. State Department was writing about this. They considered it a UFO. What it was, I don't know. A program was activated, however, which we know was a kind of UFO retrieval team, which was called Project Moondust, and it was activated. Moondust was a 3-person team for the retrieval of foreign space objects. And part of Moondust, they distinguished Russian and American satellites from UFOs. UFOs were part of the thing that they investigated. In China, 1978, the middle of China, as you can see, the CIA collected this report. Chinese military were at an air base, a place called Lintao Air Base. In the evening, the soldiers were just watching an outdoor movie when these were all officers, Chinese officers. A large object passed over very low going west. It was very long. It had 2 searchlights and a glowing tail. According to one of the witnesses, he said it was clearly not a meteor, nor a swarm of locusts or birds, nor an airplane. As we are all fighter pilots, we could say this with some certainty. In the CIA file on this, it was stated that the object, according to the witnesses, covered half the sky. Wow. Whatever it was huge. This sighting from Chile in December of 1978 is one of my most favorite sightings to look at. It's an incredible case. That's the location, as you can see, right by the Pacific Ocean. Chilean military were doing standard training of fighter aircraft, and two pilots, two aircraft, saw an absolutely gargantuan object in that vicinity where the red dot is. They saw it visually, they tracked it on their airborne radar, and it was tracked on ground-based radar all at the same time. This object instantly accelerated and departed when they got close enough to it. It had the radar return equal to that of 10 aircraft carriers. Now, the only difference is that this wasn't floating on the water, this was up in the air, whatever this could be. And it took off with instant acceleration. I won't talk too much about this. Peter's written about this, the Rendlesham Forest case in the United Kingdom in England. A very well-known incident. I'm sure some of you may be familiar with it. In December 1980, over a series of several nights, American military personnel in England had a very unusual, complex sighting, series of sightings, including that of a landed craft in the forest near the base. The base, which to this day is not officially acknowledged, but it is known, had nuclear ordnance on site. And this was something that the British public was not supposed to know about, but it is an unstated, it is an open secret, I guess we could say. So they had nuclear weapons there too. At one point, the lieutenant commander of the base, Charles Halt, was out with a detachment, and they saw an object shine an intensely bright, laser-like beam of light down to the ground, exactly where their nuclear weapons were being stored. Peter and his co-author, Larry Warren, did an interview with Charles Halt some years later, and I'm just going to quote him for you, Peter. Charles Halt said to them, "This happened, and the beam of light adversely affected the ordnance." So that it did something in a negative way to that nuclear ordnance. What specifically, I don't know. Yes, Kapustin Yar in the Soviet Union. This is an unbelievable case. When the Soviet Union was breaking apart in the late 1980s, when countries are in political crisis, I've always felt this is when there are opportunities for leaked information to come out. It's happened many times. It certainly happened in the case of the Soviets. So that, by the way, how am I doing for time? How much time?
Okay.
I'm good? Okay. So in the summer of 1989, and this is the location of Kapustin Yar, you can see that map down there, it's the southern part of the Soviet Union. This is probably it was their major rocket launch facility. Equivalent to, in America, we have something called White Sands in New Mexico, which is our major one. This is their major one. And this is a very involved case. I'm only going to summarize it, but very late at night, around midnight, first one object arrived. It just flew in. It was a disc-shaped object. It hovered low over the base. Officers were wondering, what is this? They scrambled a jet to intercept it. It was easily able to outmaneuver their best jets. And then two more objects eventually joined the first. And for a couple of hours, there was this cat and mouse game, as it were. The jets would chase these objects, and they easily evaded, including very rapid acceleration and much more. Many witnesses to this. This is part of the KGB's file, which was leaked out, which came out during the period that the Soviet Union was in a state of crisis. There's some very good KGB files that we have as a result of this. Over Belgium and northwest Germany in 1989-1990, triangular objects were seen many times. There's been some debate about this photograph. Every single good piece of UFO evidence at some point or another is subject to a major attack by debunkers. There's no exception. This particular photograph was analyzed minutely by the Royal Belgian Air Force. They said it was a legitimate photograph. We do know that there were many sightings of perfectly triangular craft over Belgium for a 6-month period, late 1989 going into 1990. Excellent quality witnesses, including police and military personnel, as well as just ordinary civilians. Low, hovering, perfect triangular objects, silent, but they were not flying saucers, they were triangles. But they had all of the characteristics otherwise of flying saucers. On the night of March 31st, 1990, was the culmination of this, in which Belgian F-16 fighter jets were scrambled to intercept these objects, which were being seen by much of the public, by thousands of people. And according to the press conference that the Belgian Air Force gave, they actually were open enough to talk about this. They said the speeds of the triangles of the object were too fast and too slow to be aircraft. In other words, sometimes they would be going much slower than the stall speeds of any aircraft could be falling out of the sky, but they were able to do that, and they also accelerated far too rapidly for any aircraft that we knew of. And they just state, no explanation can be given. Well, at one point, one of these objects was tracked on radar descending more than 1 kilometer within 1 second. It just dropped. That was on the Belgian radar. So really extraordinary thing. And at the time, of course, publicly, the newspapers were saying, well, maybe they just saw the recently unveiled stealth fighter, which was also angular, which looked a little bit triangular at times. And there was speculation that this was the case, but there's no way. There's absolutely no way this could be a stealth fighter. Flying over Belgian airspace, a NATO ally, and with the capabilities that were just off the charts. I have way too much information here on this one. I'll just summarize it. In the spring of 1990, again, back to the Soviet Union, they had a lot of interesting sightings at this time. This one was near Moscow in March of 1990. What's interesting about it is simply that this object, again, was seen by many, many witnesses doing incredible maneuvers. The Soviet military attempted to intercept this object. It was doing S-turns horizontally and vertically. And at one point, one of the Soviet jet fighters was trying to chase it, and then suddenly found that he was being chased by it. It was on his tail. How did that happen? It received confirmation by the Deputy Minister of Defense, who said, yes, this happened, and by the Chief of the Air Defense Forces, the General Igor Maltsev, who said that they had over 100 visuals by military personnel for this case. 2 photographs, none of which we had seen, but 2 photographs were taken. And he said, whoever they are, they have somehow come to terms with gravity. At the present time, he said, terrestrial machines could hardly have such capabilities. Indeed, whatever these objects, and I'll talk about this tomorrow, where I will be going in much more in depth about this phenomenon, in terms of, and also like why the secrecy is so profound. And I'll just say here, I think one of the key reasons it's so profound is that whatever these objects are using to maneuver around, it's certainly not petroleum. It's something vastly better. They have discovered, they are using, whether it's something that Reich speculated about relating to orgone, or something related to this. It's something totally different, that if we were to have this accessible to our civilization, would have obviously completely revolutionized the entire human civilization overnight. And so I would suggest that the implications are so profound that those people who are at the top of our human pyramid, they know this. And I'll talk in my next lecture as to how and why that secrecy structure exists, like how it operates, and how it operates internationally. People often ask me, the U.S. isn't the only nation in the world, even though they like to think they are, so what about other countries? And I think I have a good explanation for that. In the now famous secret base of Area 51, around 1990, once the existence of this base in Nevada came to be known, people started to go there. and take pictures. This was one that was taken in February 1990 of a hat-shaped object. It's a good photograph. And a few years later, out of the same region, Area 51 is part of what is known as the Nellis testing range, Nellis Air Force Base, not far from Las Vegas. A video was leaked out to a television show at the time, and this is a completely legitimate video, it's real. And what it does is it shows, this has been analyzed extensively, so it shows an object that is maneuvering in incredible ways, including making a right-angled turn at a speed of about 200 kilometers per hour, just a right-angled turn. Achieving very slow speeds and instantly rapid speeds. And you can hear the voices of the two Air Force personnel who are recording this at their station. And they're saying things like, what is that? What can that be? Like, they clearly don't know what it was. This object comes into view, they record it, and it goes away. At one point, it seems like the object changed its shape. It's hard to say, but that's what it looks like. When I think about this video, a couple of things stand out. One, it's been over 20 years, and the government still, the U.S. government, will not acknowledge that they have anything like this. So if we made this, it doesn't officially exist even today. It's been 22 years. It changed its shape, and it made a non-radius turn. That is a sharp right-angle turn at a high speed. I would like to know what can do that. Oh yeah, there's a young me. That's me with, if you look carefully, you can see a little bit of dark hair and hope in my eyes. Look at hope there. Look at that. So this is a case that took place just outside Washington, D.C. in 2002. So after 9/11, and I spoke to several of these witnesses, and this was reported in the Washington Post, which shocking because the Washington Post is nothing other than propaganda for the U.S. State Department and CIA. But they had to report this one because the story had gotten out. And they had to do something to basically put the story to sleep. What happened was that late at night, a lot of people heard the jets rumbling about above them in the sky, and they went out to look, and what they saw were F-16 jets chasing after multiple UFOs. Now, some witnesses only saw one UFO. It depends on the time that they saw it. Other witnesses saw multiple. This gentleman here reminded me a lot of my dad. He's a retired Washington, D.C. police officer named Gary Dillman. He saw several jets chasing at least two UFOs. Large, orange, incredible maneuverability. I spoke to another witness, Rennie Rogers, who does government work, and he was just watching TV late at night, and he heard the jets. He went outside, and he saw an object descend at an 80-degree angle and then stop. Just stopped. And then he saw the jets coming after it, and then he said, and this thing just took off, gone. The jets had no chance to catch it. Now, keep in mind, this is just outside Washington, D.C., less than 1 year after 9/11. If you don't think that's important, then think again. But the Air Force really would not want to talk about this. The poor Air Force spokesperson, the media got to this guy, and this spokesperson for the Air Force said, well, it could have been any number of things. And I'd like to know what things could it be, because it's a bluish-orange object that's being chased and outperforming our best fighter interceptors. I'd like to know what things this could be. He didn't really go into that. An anonymous Air Force person did state that the object was tracked on radar and disappeared off the radar. So that's interesting. So this is a very fascinating thing. And I've got one or two other cases here I want to discuss. Oh yeah, I have a lot of my pictures in this one. This is my earlier incarnation of the beard, still with nice dark hair. Yeah, I was on the goofy Glenn Beck show for this one. on CNN. So this was in relation to the O'Hare Airport case. This is Chicago. O'Hare Airport is one of the busiest airports in the world. And in November of 2006, many airport employees were outside, saw crystal clear a disc-shaped gray object below the clouds. It was there for about 10 or 15 minutes, and every one of them said it took off and went through the cloud and punched a hole through the cloud, left a hole through the cloud. They were told by their employer that they were not supposed to talk about this. One of them did, put it out anonymously to the National UFO Reporting Center, actually, which I mentioned earlier. And that journalist on the right, John Hildebrand, I think that's his name, he wrote an article for the Chicago Tribune newspaper about it, and the story took off and became a very big story indeed. And so that was that whole case, and what it was, well, your guess is as good as mine. Now this image is not an actual photograph. I actually photoshopped this myself, I just want you to be aware. Stephenville, Texas is in the middle of Texas, and what was described was an enormous object, very similar to this, being chased by F-16 jets, and the size ratio was about right. So these jets were really tiny. I don't think that they got that close to the object, but I just put that in so you could see. What ended up happening was that a number of witnesses saw a absolutely gargantuan, huge object fly low and at one point stop over them. Some very, very close witness sightings of this thing. And then the object took off. One of them said it was bigger than a Walmart. You know what Walmart is?
Yes.
If there are ever flying Walmarts, I'm out of here. I'll move to another country. I'll go to Mars, I don't know. Walmart's like one of those huge shopping centers, you know, they're just gargantuan. Anyway, the Air Force once again said, no, we don't know anything about F-16s chasing any object. What are you talking about? Because witnesses said they saw F-16s chasing this object. And then the Air Force had to admit, oh, well, yes, we do appear to have had a training mission of F-16s out there in the area. But UFOs, we have no knowledge of that. And then somehow MUFON, the organization, got hold of the radar recordings of the event and indeed showed that radar was tracking an unknown object. And the very interesting thing about this, and this is again a matter of debate, but it does appear to me that when the object left the radar, it was argued that it was going in the direction of the Crawford Ranch in Texas, which was where George W. Bush, president, was staying at that time. Is this the truth? I don't know. But that's been the argument, that it was going in that direction.
Pick him up?
So, and then I'm sorry?
To pick him up?
To pick him up.
And to drop
He
off.
needed another brain infusion. I don't know what he needed. Or a new probe of some sort. Yeah. You know, just saying, I went through 8 years of that presidency and just getting like beat over the head with a big stick every goddamn year. And then we had Obama come in, and I thought, oh wow, great, you know, we got a cool president, and he's black, and that's awesome, and he doesn't sound like he's 12 years old, and it's just more of the same. It's exactly the same. You go through 8 years of Bush, get beat up by that. You have 8 years of Obama. It's like, please, enough. But now we'll get Hillary Clinton. Wasn't that great?
Well,
I kid.
maybe Trump.
Maybe Trump.
It's the same here.
Yeah, it's no different anyway. I know.
Not different.
It's like I feel like in the old American Wild West, you know, with the gunslingers going pow pow pow. I feel that's like me. I'm like, Trump is shooting at me and Hillary is shooting at me. I have no way to escape from these politicians. Anyway, that's another lecture for another time. This is the last UFO case I want to discuss with you. This one also, this is my witness. I did my own research in this one. It's the most northern habitation in the world. And you can see on the map, it's not going to get any more north than that, guys. at a base, a Canadian base called CFS Alert. I have a lot of Canadian cases. I'm from New York. I'm not a Canadian, but I live near Canada, so I think I interact a lot with them. Anyway, this is took place in January of 2008, the same month as the Stephenville case that I just mentioned. Not the same day. Anyway, this base was created in the 1950s for electronic listening on the Soviet Union, so they would spy across the Arctic Ocean on the Russians. And that's what it looks like. All right, there's really not a lot going on there. The base is still in operation today. It's run by the Canadians. There's about 50 personnel there year-round. And in January of 2008, they were in the middle of an Arctic winter where it's pitch black, 24 hours a day, right? No sunlight. And my witness described this in great detail to me. He said they'd had some bad weather for a few days, and now the weather had gotten a little bit better. And the base commander, who was a friend of his, said, "I'd like to go for a hike just to get some exercise. Who would like to come with me?" And about 10 or so men on the base went with him, and they went on a hike in this area. Who knows where they're going to hike to, but that's what they did. So it's dark, it's black, and my witness was in the base cafeteria getting lunch. And he said there was like a large window leading outside, and he said suddenly outside it became brighter than daylight for about 10 minutes. And his initial reaction was simply that, oh, well, we must have floodlights, and someone turned on the lights. But that was not what happened. About 20 minutes later, all of the men came back to the base, and they were just in a state of shock. He spoke with many of them, and what they said is that an elongated object came in very low, silently over the base, stopped, and then shone this intensely bright light down on the entire area for 10 minutes. And then, to make it even better, it just glided silently over the frozen Arctic Ocean, where there is nothing for thousands of miles. Who knows where it went? I talked with this man at length about possible drone, aircraft, what could account for this. The problem with any of these explanations is that the mere range alone is vastly greater than anything that we know of. I mean, this would have a range of thousands of miles with incredible maneuverability and ability to navigate the most treacherous places on our planet. It just is not known. Like, he couldn't figure it out. I can't figure it out. I don't know what that could be. It seems to me that there is an agency, there is a group that is not our civilization, that is working here on this planet. I have in addition to writing books, I have a small publishing company, and I publish some interesting books by really great writers. I just published one by two guys who were writing about Russia's USO history, so underwater UFOs, unidentified submersible objects. A lot of water-based UFO sightings. So they just did a book on the history of Russia's interaction with us. And what I learned from that book is that Russia has had a lot of encounters with objects going into and out of the Arctic Ocean along the northern coast there. And again, there's just, what is there? No one lives there, but there's activity there. This activity is not simply around the world in all the populated areas where people are. It is everywhere where there are people and where there are no people. Whatever they're doing, I think they have an infrastructure that involves this entire planet for their own reasons. So what do I say here? What is this all about? Oh yes, the Neva fire graphic. I forgot that I put that in. I would say there is an overwhelming amount of evidence of military interest in UFOs. I would say furthermore that it's not all a fun relationship. Something is happening that is confrontational. I'm not saying that I know who are the good guys and who are the bad guys here. if the U.S. military is involved, I would usually be inclined to say that they're the bad guys. But I don't really know what's going on, frankly. There's something that involves great secrecy to this day. I have a few more things to say here, and I want to make sure I'm not at the very end. If I am, oh yes. So let me have a couple of remarks. How much time do I have? 10 minutes? Wow. I would like to point out that I'm finishing on time. Before we got here, we were having lunch, and I was sitting across from Peter. Peter was very happy to tell me how exact he was on getting his lectures done on time. I said, well, it's very good. I'm glad you did that. I will try to do the same. Just saying, my friend.
I'll get you back to that.
I'm actually shocked that I'm done on time. So since I have a few minutes, by the way, I hope has the translation been helpful? Yes. Have you been able to understand?
Yeah.
I've tried to speak a little more slowly than I usually do. I hope that's been helpful. What I've described here is truly just scratching the surface of what is really, to me, the most fascinating subject that I can imagine. There is a great depth to this. When you think of all of the facets of the UFO phenomenon, there's all of these little subsections of it that you could spend your entire life just studying one part of it. You could spend your entire life studying the military confrontations that I just was talking about here. You could spend your entire life studying the abduction phenomenon. You could spend your entire life studying claims of benevolent contact that people have with these other beings. You could spend your entire lifetime trying to understand the science behind this, the crazy science that doesn't make sense, but in fact it does make sense when you really study, whether it's propulsion technology or consciousness itself. After all, how is it possible that in almost every single case of alleged contact that we have with them, it's always telepathic? Always. Right? So what does that say about us? What does that say about them? It says to me that we have these capabilities as well. That uncovering the real truth of this phenomenon will be at least as enlightening for what we are as what they are. I've come to believe that. The subject affects every aspect of our civilization, of our lives. And yet, as I started this lecture, it is subject to really no recognition, no official recognition. And I guess what I would say here is, every now and then people will come up to me and say, well, it doesn't really matter what the government says. We are what matters, and we'll just acknowledge it anyway. And I agree in a way, but I don't agree in a way. My attitude is that, I'm well aware that we're moving into a true global fascism. We're well along the road. I'll be talking a lot about this in my next lecture. So the question is, what do we do about it? Do I simply say, well, it doesn't matter what the government thinks? But I don't want to say that, because I think that the governments should always be responsive to citizens, always. In the United States, in Greece, everywhere. And when a government is not responsive to us, then that is fascism. It's not fascism of the 1930s, where they just tell you it's fascism. I mean, no government is going to be so stupid today as to say, oh yeah, we're going to have a fascist society for you. Of course not. They'll call it democracy. They'll call it whatever they want. They won't call it what it is. When a government can read every email you have and read every text message you write and have you on GPS every moment of your life and can intimidate you when you protest because they'll have photographs of you and they'll triangulate your face and they'll put you in a database, that is fascism. And whatever they want to call it. And so when you're in a society that's moving toward fascism, do we simply say, well, it doesn't really matter what the government thinks? I say no. I say that this subject is important enough that my government and our governments should be responsive to citizens. It's not for a matter of science. It's a matter of freedom. And for my part, I think I'll close with this statement. I have no interest in having a disclosure that is given to me by a fascist government. I don't want any part of it. I'll build a rocket ship and move to Mars. I won't be part of it. But I do want a disclosure that is driven by citizens that force their governments to respond to them the way governments are supposed to respond. That, to me, I feel is our truest destiny, because what we have to do in this world is unlearn the helplessness that is being forced on all of us, wherever we are. And the only way to take back that power, it seems to me, is by being brave and by acting in the best way we can to force governments to be responsive to what we need and what we are, and to obtain the truth in all of its forms, whether it has to do with UFOs or orgonomy or any other element of politics and finance and anything else that's going on. That's our job as citizens. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time.